When I was a kid, I lived in Saudi Arabia for a few years. And in Saudi Arabia, what you do for fun is you drive out into the desert. If you imagine Saudi Arabia and in the Riyadh area where I live, if you imagine it as just a giant desert with a couple palm trees and maybe some buildings built by oil, you'd be about right, at least in 1985 when I lived there. And so what you'd see people do, they'd be driving down these highways, no speed limits, and they just pull off into the desert. Because you could. Everything was pretty much flat until you got out to the sand dunes, and you could drive out into the desert at sunset, and you'd see everything sort of glittering. If you've seen that in the movies and things like that, that's a real thing. Those are called desert diamonds. And so you drive out into the desert, and there's sand dunes and everything like that, and some people even ski down them. That's a real thing. Or drive snowmobiles over them. That's what you do kind of for fun if you live in the desert. And that's what we did a lot. We kind of got into it, driving out into the desert and looking for interesting rocks. And I was only about 10, so it was really pretty cool. And one day my dad said, instead of driving out into the desert, we're going to go to the wadi. And I did probably what y'all did when you heard this word in the reading, what's a wadi? It's a very strange word, but he said, let's just go. You'll see when you get there. So we drove out into the desert, and we came to the wadi, and I had heard my friends talk about it. It was kind of a destination. And I wondered what was going on with this strange word. We learned a lot of Arabic words, but that wasn't one of them. And so we drove out into the desert, and it looked a lot like normal, a lot of sand. Looked around as far as the eye could see. But then when you walked a little closer, you saw something like a small Grand Canyon. When you got to the edge of it, you could climb down into it, into this canyon. I found out that a wadi is a dry riverbed that's made kind of a canyon through the desert. And you climb down into it, and you can't really see above you. It's kind of like being in the Grand Canyon or in any canyon. And you're down there, and if you've been to the Middle East, it's like when you open the oven, and the hot air comes at you, it's like that all the time. When that wind blows, there is nothing like that. And the sand, and we're standing at the bottom of this riverbed. And the cool thing about this particular wadi that people went to is that there was a well there. And this well was so old, nobody knew how old it was. They guessed maybe 3,000 years. And so we went into this riverbed, and we're standing at the bottom of it, and the crazy desert wind is blowing, and there's an ancient well. And I remember, at 10 years old, having the first moment of sort of existential shock. Like, there were people here a long time before me. And there will be people here a long time after me. And for some reason, being in that place, in the wadi, in that canyon with the ancient well next to me, I started to think about the big questions, like capital B, capital Q, the big questions of life and of death and of how life goes on even in the middle of that. And it sounds a little much for a 10-year-old, but the desert and being in that place made me think about stuff like that. And I was wondering, because I was remembering back to that experience, I was wondering if that's why Elijah spent all that time in a wadi. Because it's kind of a holy place. You don't think of that as just a dry riverbed as being a holy place, but it was. It was something that inspired thoughts about why are we all here and things like that. And Elijah was driven out to the wadi to kind of hide there and to stay there and to think about these big questions. Elijah was a preacher and a prophet, and in those times, preachers and prophets, as they do sometimes today, they were supposed to speak the truth to power. They were supposed to speak the truth of what God wanted to the people who were in charge. And so Elijah had a particularly tough job because he was serving under an evil king, King Ahab. Sometimes these Old Testament stories sound like fairy tales to me. This one is complete with the evil king, King Ahab. And he was worshiping Baal, this other god. Now, I don't think the Bible is clear on a lot of things, but the Bible is very clear that you're supposed to worship only God. Worship God. That's it. Don't worship all these other gods. 10 Commandments, that kind of stuff. But this king, King Ahab, the evil king, he was worshiping this other god because that God promised to bring rain. And so what Elijah did was Elijah said, there's not going to be any rain until you pray to the actual God. And so Elijah went out into the wadi, and that was an act of great faith because it was dry there. He was totally depending on God for protection. And so he was driven out into the wadi and was there and was thinking about these big questions of life and death. And there came a time when even the little trickle of water in that riverbed dried up. And he didn't know what he was going to do until God said, go to this village, and there's a widow there who's going to take care of you. So he went to the village, and of course, he sees the widow right away, and he says, can I have some water? And she goes to bring him water, just like God promised, and he says, also, by the way, I'm starving. Can I have some food, too? And her wonderful Middle Eastern hospitality, she says, I'm sorry, sir, but all I have is food enough for me and my son. We're in a drought, if you hadn't noticed. We can't grow food. We don't have anything. I'm just going to go home, make enough food for me and my son, and we're going to lay down and die. She had given up hope right at the second when Elijah met her. And Elijah says, okay, but there's something I want you to try first. I want you to go home and make me a pancake and bring it to me. And then when that's done, I want you to make a pancake for your son, and I want you to make a pancake for yourself, and we'll see what happens from there. And so she went home, and she made pancakes, and everybody ate one. And then the next day, she made pancakes, and everybody ate one, and it was enough. And this, if people ask you what you learn in your Lutheran church, you can tell them, I learned about the miracle of the everlasting pancakes. That's what this was. Enough to sustain them day after day. Everybody has this in their culture. I thought a little flour, a little oil, what do you make? In my culture, which is some sort of hybrid German, whatever, American, we make pancakes. We don't make lefse or tortillas or any of that kind of stuff. But that's what we're talking about, is a flat bread, a basic food. And so they had enough pancakes to sustain them day after day after day after they thought that they were going to die. The miracle of the everlasting pancakes. Pretty amazing thing for God to do, to give them life when there wasn't any. But then what happened is the woman, her son, got sick and died, as people do. And the woman, you can see her, she stops believing. She says at one point, your God did this to me. We've heard that before. Your God did this. How can your God let these things happen? We think about all these things that are going on this week and what I've heard about this past year and up the Northeast. That's what we hear sometimes. How is your God letting this happen? And this is what Elijah does for the woman. He goes and takes the child and goes upstairs and does some sort of divine EMT chest compressions with this boy and saves him. This is the first resurrection in the Bible. It's another thing you learned today. Pancakes. The first resurrection in the Bible when Elijah brings this child back to life. And only after she sees a resurrection does this woman have faith. So I thought about us. What do we need? What do we need for belief? Do we need a resurrection? Or would it just take pancakes? I can't talk about all saints without talking about my dad. He was a saint. If you would have asked me in high school, I would have said, not a saint. He was a strict German guy. But he was a wonderful dad, and he taught Sunday school, and he had a deep faith and would talk about sermons with us. And he passed away 15 years ago this Christmas. When my dad died, he was very beloved in our church, and the Lutherans converged. They brought casseroles, they brought desserts, they brought cold cuts, they brought everything, to feed my mom, the new widow, and her family, and they stocked our fridge, and I don't remember any of it. But I do remember about a week later, my best friend from high school, Sarah, called me and said, "What would you like to eat? Is there anything that sounds good to you?" And I said, I think maybe I'd like some soup, but I'm not sure. And so since we were 22 and we didn't cook, she went to O'Charlie's and she ordered that cheese soup to go. They still have it. She ordered that soup for me. And her boyfriend, who's now her husband of 14 years, they made me chocolate chip cookies. And I remember eating that meal, and it tasted good for the first time after that tragedy in my life, after my dad died. And I remember eating that meal. I still remember how it tasted, and I remember thinking that this is something that I can believe in. That week, I didn't really believe in God, or if I believed in God, I believed in a God that had shut the door and locked it with a key. But I could believe in the soup, that it tasted good. And I could believe in the love of my friend who brought this for me, who wanted to know what I needed in the middle of this. Sometimes that's what we get. We don't get a divine EMT resurrection. Sometimes all we get is pancakes or soup. We get that little thing that keeps us going in the midst of situations that seem impossible. And if it seems impossible to believe in God, I think that's okay. We go through times of doubt and belief in our lives, depending on our circumstances, depending on what's going on with us. We go through these times like Elijah and the widow, of when we doubt and when we believe. And when it seems impossible to believe, start with something like the pancakes. Start with something like something that somebody did for you. Start with something like someone bringing you soup and it tasting good for the first time, and maybe that you have hope that things would be okay, that maybe you would believe again. Sometimes it's okay to just believe in the pancakes. Amen.